Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Wave Web series. So we are excited to have you with us today as we sit down with the three co-founders of Tidal Cyber, a global security leader reshaping threat-led defense. Just a bit about Tidal Cyber before we introduce our guest speakers. Tidal Cyber is flipping the traditional defensive model by putting real adversary behavior at the center of defense. Our co-founders will be talking quite a bit about threat-led defense during the webcast and why adversary behavior is so important. In addition, today we are very excited to announce the release of the industry's first ever library of structured procedures and platform features that enable analysts and defenders to immediately operationalize procedural level threat intelligence. We will be sharing more about this groundbreaking capability with you today as well. So now let's introduce our guest speakers. First, we are pleased to welcome Rick Gordon, CEO and co-founder of Tidal Cyber. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you.
Our next guest speaker is Richard Struess, Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Tidal Cyber. Welcome, Rich.
Thanks for having me.
And last, we would like to welcome Frank Duff, our Chief Innovation Officer and co-founder of Tidal Cyber. Welcome, Frank.
Thanks for having me and looking forward to this.
So I won't talk too much about our co-founders as they will share their unique story and one that has definitely contributed to Tidal Cyber's success so far. So Rich, as one of our co-founders of Tidal, you've all known each other for quite some time, and I believe you even first met at MITRE. Can you share more about this story and experience and how this history has helped build not only just a strong partnership, but a shared vision at Tidal Cyber?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because all three of us came to MITRE at different points in time for different reasons. But once we started working together, that's really when the magic started to happen. So Frank had been at MITRE the longest. Rick had been there the most recently. And then I had joined after I left the Department of Homeland Security in 2017. And I showed up at MITRE with a really specific goal in mind, and that was to create MITRE's first privately funded research and development center. And I set out to do that with my MITRE co-founder, John Baker. And we launched something called the Center for Threat Informed Defense. And you have to understand the context. This is 2017. The MITRE attack knowledge base, which came to life inside of MITRE in 2012, had been publicly released just about 2 years earlier in 2015. But even just 2 years after that, we were starting to see a really incredible organic growth in the global adoption of this freely available knowledge base of adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs. And what we were seeing was that whether it was a CTI team or a detection engineering team, or a red team or a hunt team or a vendor of different cybersecurity services, people were sort of just naturally coalescing around the attack knowledge base. And I think one of the key reasons why it was filling a critical gap as a common language that was allowing different parts of cybersecurity infrastructure to connect. The people doing those different jobs were now able to talk in a much sort of higher fidelity way about the things they were seeing, the things they were looking for, what adversaries were doing, what they were emulating. And so that was a really, really special time at MITRE. Once John and I launched the Center for Threat Informed Defense in 2019 with some of the largest and most sophisticated organizations from around the world, including financial institutions, healthcare, manufacturing, technology, and other kinds of companies, we were doing research and development on how to make this new discipline of threat-informed defense, using an understanding of adversary behavior to improve, to understand, assess, and optimize your defenses. What we started to see was that as promising as attack was, and as promising as threat-informed defense is and was, what we were also seeing is even these very large, well-resourced organizations were struggling to really implement it at scale. And that's when Rick and Frank and I started to, who were all working in and around attack at that time, started to sort of put our heads together.
terrific. I mean, it's just such an awesome story. And Frank, I know you have a bit to add to that. Is you're the founder of MITRE Attacks Evaluation, so share your experience as well.
Absolutely. And I was here I was there at MITRE the longest, as Rich alluded to. I was there for about 20 years. And so, I mean, I lived and breathed MITRE and loved everything that was about MITRE. The last half of my career was all around MITRE ATT&CK, right? Is being able to do detection engineering, figure out how do we minimize the median dwell time, right? It was, I think, close to 2/3 of a year when ATT&CK was founded, in terms of being able to identify adversaries in the network. And so we were doing a bunch of research around that, and ATT&CK formed out of necessity. It was really around trying to make it so that we could communicate. And that's really one of the powers of it, as Rich already spoke to. But fast forward, ATT&CK, we realized was going to be something that was really valuable for the community at large. And Blake Strom and the leadership team around ATT&CK pushed for its public release. As it started to gain traction, they realized, you know what, maybe we should be doing more with the vendor community to get them to adopt it. And so that's where I started working in a DIUX type of environment to help pull in ATT&CK to vendor communities, right? Working with the end games back when they existed, the CrowdStrikes and so on and so forth, on how to adopt ATT&CK. That naturally led to the ATT&CK evaluations program, where we would want to use ATT&CK as a measure of understanding how these tools were progressing. But one of the really unique things that we were doing with it wasn't just to test the vendors. We didn't want to just be a testing organization at the time. It was really about being able to help push vendors forward, right? It's about them adopting ATT&CK, understanding how to leverage ATT&CK, make sure that they're using the right ways. The last thing we need to see is coverage maps where everybody says that I cover every technique known to mankind, right? Like that was the problem. That was what marketing was giving us. But instead, there's like so much nuance to ATT&CK that we had to help push people forward for. And that's where the ATT&CK evaluations effort, I think, really had a really big impact. It was being able to work with all of those, especially EDRs, were coming and working with us, being able to move that entire market forward just as it was beginning, right? Being able to make sure that they were thinking about things in a threat-led way, right? It was a little bit ahead of the time, but it was like not just saying, let's cover all the tech. It's like, how do you cover these techniques? How do you actually address these techniques? And I think that that's really where ATT&CK helped move things from make sure that they're collecting the right command line data, make sure that they're actually doing PowerShell monitoring, right? There's a round 2 where nobody was doing PowerShell monitoring effectively. So we did ever get on round 3, and everybody started figuring out how to detect PowerShell and things like that. So it was one of those things where we helped move that forward. And I think you see a lot of that natural mindset in realizing what Tidal has become. But it was in that process that we're learning, okay, well, users at the end of the day, it's great that we're advancing the vendor community, but actually, how do we make it so people can answer which vendor won? Because that's the question that they want at the end of the day. And it's a really hard question to get at. And it's a question that, frankly, MITRE wasn't really well positioned to answer on a lot of the ideals that we had. And so it was one of those things where we knew we needed to answer it, going to Rick and Rich and saying, hey, I want to do something more to help answer this question. And then being like, hey, we've got these ideas too. And we're seeing the same thing from these other perspectives, right? I'm looking from this vendor lens. Rich is there from the end user lens. Rick is the connective tissue around all of these different efforts. And it was just like mutual, kind of like all reached this decision at the same point that we needed to create a platform that actually allow people to adopt ATT&CK and answer these hard questions in a really useful way.
Yeah, that's terrific. And Rick, you're the other part of this triumvirate. So I'd love for you to add a little bit to that and a little bit of color as to why did all of you decide to create Tidal Cyber? What was the unmet need, as Frank has kind of alluded to, in the market that wasn't being addressed?
Yeah, great question. So, a lot of my perspective is really driven by experience over the last 25 years, really principally being involved in new venture development, almost exclusively in the cybersecurity industry, really as an entrepreneur, an operator, early stage investor. You sort of recognize those, I'll just say those key indicators of opportunity for, a good business. I think the principal driver for the decision to go do this came from customer input. I think we were, in particular, Rich's team at the Center for Threat Informed Defense was developing adjacent capabilities to MITRE ATT&CK. that customers were finding value in, but they were having difficulty integrating them into whatever their operations were. A variety of different use cases can benefit from the knowledge of who's attacking whom with what, using the framework that is MITRE ATT&CK. I think so. Getting that input from them, that that admonition, if you will, that they valued what we were doing, but needed it delivered in a different way, was about all I needed as an entrepreneur to hear. And then we started putting the pieces together, really trying to, I'll just say, bridge that gap that has plagued the cyber threat intelligence space really since threat intelligence has existed as a category, and that is, make the inability to make it actionable. Can we help a customer understand who's attacking them with what and what to do about it in very practical terms? And it's quite frankly, a lot of the work that Frank did, perhaps the profound work that he did, made bridging that gap finally possible. So we decided to leave and go build this company that we think is really changing the world.
Absolutely. And I was remiss to our listeners. If you'd like to, put any questions to our co-founders, you can just put them in the chat. So that's fantastic. So we recently launched threat-led defense, made some changes. Rich, tell me about and tell our listeners about Tidal Cyber's vision behind this and why it was so important.
Well, yeah, it's a really exciting time because it's really it's not a coincidence that our launch of threat-led defense coincides with also the big announcements we're making around things like procedure objects, because to my perspective, threat-led defense is Tidal's unique implementation of threat-informed defense, where amongst other things we're really adding that procedure level granularity to make CTI really more relevant and actionable across the disciplines in cybersecurity. And what we've seen so much is that you have organizations that are doing great work adopting the tactics and techniques, the T&T and TTP, but it's the P that's always sort of been missing. MITRE has done a great job systematizing tactics and techniques and sub-techniques in their knowledge base, but procedures never really got the same love for lots of different reasons. And what we've done, and Frank and his team are really the drivers behind this, really sort of revolutionizing our platform by adding in a really, I think, clever and scalable way that more granular understanding of adversary behavior at that procedure level. So detection engineers can now marry up the specific adversary commands or whatever that they're looking for with their detection rules. And the CTI team can do the same thing. A red team can test specific examples. And so I encourage people to take a look at what we're doing around procedures because it's super exciting. But threat-led defense ultimately is that mindset of saying, first, we got to figure out what it is we care about. Now, in a perfect world with infinite time and resources, we would worry about every last threat and every last defense and every last vulnerability and every last everything. But we don't live in that world of infinite resources. So fundamentally, what people have to do is prioritize. And as Frank, alluded to earlier, those early days of people trying to heat map all green with every last tactic and technique in MITRE ATT&CK, just not a winning proposition. It's actually can be detrimental to a security team to put resources into doing that when that's not really where they should be focusing. So threat-led defense starts with this notion of what are those threats, whether it's articulated at the adversary group level, campaigns, adversary software, but then being able to translate that down to the procedure level so you can really go and connect that to the things that are happening on the wire, to the things that your tools are doing to block or detect that behavior so you can get that much more granular view. Threat-led defense is really about using that understanding of threat to prioritize where you put your resources. So you're spending so by definition, you're spending your time and your energy dealing with the things you care about, the things you need to defend against. And then When you have that, completely dealt with, you can then afford to expand the aperture, but you have to start somewhere. And starting with the threats that you need to care about seems like a really logical place for us. And that's threat-led defense.
Yeah, absolutely. Rick, can you go ahead and expand upon that? Because I know we've had many conversations around threat-led defense and would love to hear what you have to say.
Sure. No, great question. I think for me, it has a lot to do with sort of, where we're starting. As I mentioned, I've been in this industry roughly for the last 25 years, and had the benefit of sort of watching it evolve over time, and the emergence of, attack surface management, asset-oriented based, approaches, compliance-oriented approaches, lots of deterministic ways of looking at, what we could get our hands on, but always sort of maybe one step shy of the ability to be able to get to that view of residual risk. And I think that has been elusive, certainly from, if we look at the way people spend their budgets, sort of checking boxes on compliance without little regard to what the reduction in residual risk they might be getting is. Similarly, when we are investing huge sums of money, trying to sort of, I'll just say, boil the ocean around tens of thousands of vulnerabilities that might be sort of introduced into the wild with any given year, we start to recognize that these old approaches are intractable. There will always be too many for us to evaluate. And eventually, as we know, many of those are irrelevant to us or represent low levels of risk, but we're forced to sort of do this evaluation that's a drain on precious, scarce resources. When we think about this from our perspective, with who's attacking us with what, that gives us the ability to sort of, in a very tractable way, start to understand our ability to reduce the likelihood of success of the adversary from reconnaissance to impact. When you look at the world from that way, you start to recognize that we have significantly spent or maybe overly focused on those countermeasures that are focused on initial access only, leaving the rest of the behaviors generally undercovered. When you look at that within that context, you start to recognize, if I focus on eliminating the ability of the adversary to move from left to right in the attack chain and start to close the gaps on these areas that I've ignored in the past, I can dramatically reduce the likelihood the adversary can be successful. There are not thousands of TTPs. From a technique and sub-technique perspective, there are under 700. So it's not a small number, but it is an infinitely more tractable number. So if we start there, we're going to have an approach that is a lot more effective.
Terrific. Thanks, Rick, and thanks, Rich. So Frank, I want to go back to procedures a little bit, because we, providers out there, claim to solve the same problems, but we believe Tidal Cyber is very unique in how we solve them. So I just kind of want to talk to you a little bit about that, and maybe emphasize and talk a little bit more about procedures as well.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that a couple things that Rick said kind of resonate in my head with how I talk about procedures and why procedures, and a little bit how we're doing things differently. I think if we look at attack as a more tractable problem, MITRE attack as a more tractable problem, 100% right? Like it's there, you can see it, right? It's the matrix, right? It's you got those 700 cells that you can color in, but that's exactly where the mindset starts to fail, because people still treat it like a compliance framework, right? People are still trying to color in the boxes and say, I have colored in all the boxes, and so I am good. But what they're missing is that missing dimension, going to what Rich said about procedures, right? Being able to identify how a technique is specifically being leveraged. Because things that I love seeing, the top 10 techniques coming out every year, right? And everybody at the top of the list has PowerShell. Talk about the most useless piece of information that you could have. Sure, PowerShell is getting used, but how is it getting used? Why is it getting used? It's the nuance about how it's getting used that's important and can drive your defensive strategy, whether you need to mitigate something or detect something or what have you, right? How are you actually going to defend it? So that's what procedures is really trying to address. It's trying to get at that more actionable level. Now, to the point that you just made, there is a lot of people that talk about procedures, right? Even ATT&CK itself has procedure examples in the knowledge base. What we spent a lot of the time over the past year doing is researching exactly what a procedure is, right? And that in itself is a long endeavor because there is no actual common definition of what a procedure is. Some organizations think about them as sub techniques. Some of them think about maybe it's multiple techniques that can be implemented with that. It's a single action that the adversary is trying to take. There's so many different ways that you could define a procedure. And so that's one of the biggest challenges is when you hear people talk about procedures, you have to say, well, what is your specific definition of procedures? And so first and foremost, Tidal and some of the content that we're doing, if you have a chance to look at some of the work that we're doing around Black Hat, take a look at that. But we're going to be talking about procedures, right? And talking about what is the definition and providing structure around it. So for the first time, it's not just a 1 to 2 sentence blurb that would exist within like the procedure examples on MITRE ATT&CK. It's actually structured objects to be able to say, okay, this is the rich technical details about how adversaries are specifically using it. Because with that information, that's actually what lets you get targeted, right? If you're thinking about how do you make attack more tractable? So 700 is good, but there's still a lot of them. So how do you make it more tractable? Well, focus on the threats that really matter to you. That will give you the set of techniques that matter to you. But now you can use procedures to get, and this is the specific ways they are leveraging those techniques to make it so that you are creating the right detections, you are hunting for the right things, you are testing the right things, right? Those are places where having a deeper level of understanding of how the thing is implemented become truly important. And I don't think that this is something that would have scaled before. I want to give credit here to Harrison Van Riper, who was part of Zero Shot shortly before us. He spent some time at MITRE and Red Canary before that. But it was his technology with Zero Shot that's allowed us to really understand and structure this data and do it at scale, right? And so now it is something that we can understand all the different variants that all these different threats are leveraging from these reports, so that we can give now practitioners, no crap, this is actually what you can do about the problem. So it's not just about informing on the threat, it's about being able to take really crisp information and know what you need to do about it. And that's really where the uniqueness of our approach on our platform is really going to start shining as we move forward beyond just attack into the procedure world.
Yeah,
If I could just add on to that, if I may, Anne.
please.
And that is, what I'm particularly proud of what we've done is to really sort of balance. One of the things that made ATT&CK work so well is it got the abstraction right? The level of abstraction, not too high level, not too low level. And so that's turned out to be a super valuable set of constructs for the better part of a decade. And so, but what we've been able to do is by adding procedures and the relationships to procedures into our knowledge graph, for those people who are ready and able to deal with procedures, we have full support for that. For those who are still wrapping their heads around the more fundamental tactics and techniques, they don't have to dive into procedures on day one if they don't want to. So I think we've done a really good job of sort of balancing and creating the best of both worlds: procedure level granularity whenever and wherever you need it, but also preserving some of that all of that abstraction that really has made ATT&CK something that people can actually agree on and wrap their hands around.
Terrific. And thank you, Rich. And two things that Frank brought up, and I'm going to throw this over to Rick, is that common definition of procedures wasn't something that we decided on our own. I think you worked with researchers and MITRE, and love for you to kind of expand upon this. And I think the other part of that is, now that we've done this, what are the results? What are the outcomes that we can look forward to based on having procedures available?
So great question. I actually think procedures, oftentimes by folks in the industry, is often used, but often misunderstood. And so I think we've been very careful as we've sort of defined what it means. Obviously it's presenting data at a greater level of specificity that Rich said, or lower level of abstraction. Specificity matters as you're describing what it is we're trying to defend against. The more specific you are, the more accurate you can be in the way you're prescribing the defenses, and also the combination of those things. The greater the number of specific elements of the implementation there are, the more specific it is. When you develop a set of capabilities that can defend against it, you can when you prescribe that defense, it also increases the accuracy of whatever the countermeasure is. So all of those things matter. The second question that you asked is like, but when does it matter? Like, in what use cases is this most relevant in? It's not the level of abstraction is, as Rich pointed out, is super useful as we're talking about tactics, techniques, and procedures. Each of those provides a different level of abstraction that is useful in the way that we're thinking about our security architecture, making decisions about where we need to make our next bets, where we might want to reallocate, where we might be over-invested. And I think from a security architecture perspective, what we've found in that level of decision making, thinking, or doing the thinking at the technique and sub-technique level works really well. But as we get into the more tactical, the more prescriptive parts of a security operation, like threat hunting, like detection engineering, that information, that specificity really matters, because oftentimes the question that we're asking is more specific than what combination of techniques we expect to be looking for. When we have the data that is more specific and we can be more prescriptive in the way that we're describing it, we can also be more prescriptive in the way that we're detecting it or defending it against it. And all of that matters in particular in those two use cases.
Terrific. And a question has come in, and we've talked a little bit about scale, but that's one of the wonderful things about our platform. And so we have a community edition out there, but do we scale for enterprise? And anybody can take that question. Frank?
Rich, did you want to get it?
Yeah, so our platform was designed from the get-go to meet the needs of some of the largest organizations around the world. Whether it's our knowledge graph or our coverage mapping, it's all designed with the notion that the kinds of organizations that are ready and able to do threat-informed defense, threat-led defense, are generally larger and more sophisticated, and their data volumes and scale are such that we need to be able to scale. And so as we've introduced procedures into the platform, now we're talking about data at a different scale than the 679 techniques and sub-techniques in the latest version of MITRE ATT&CK. And so it is critical to be able to scale. I think in addition to be able to scale, it's also to be able to represent the variety of realities across a large organization. What do I mean by that? Well, not every part of a large, let's say, multinational is facing the same threats. So it's really important that your platform be able to scale, to be able to say, oh, well, our Asia Pacific region, they're facing some additional threats or different set of threats than our European subsidiary or our North American operations. And in the same way, most of our customers have very heterogeneous sets of security tools defending the environment. There's not one set of tools that's identically deployed and configured throughout the enterprise. So being able to scale in that way to be able to not only say, here are the threats that are of concern in this context, it's also to be able to say, and here are the specific defenses that are defending that European subsidiary and how it differs from the North American headquarters or the APAC headquarters. Those are also important elements of scale. It's almost more like, to make up a term, semantic scaling as opposed to just sort of volume-based scaling. So but both are important. And so as we've introduced procedures, which is significantly greater data volume, we've also put a lot of time and attention into making sure that our approaches scale. And so when people take a look at the platform, I think they'll particularly enjoy how we take and deal with similar sets of procedures in the environment to make it a lot easier for people to reason about categories of procedures.
Terrific. Anybody else? All right. So, as we start to wind down, we've got a few more things to discuss. I'm going to ask each of you where you see the future of defensive security heading and how do you see the market evolving? And then, what I'd like to do is, once we've kind of gone through that, is maybe end a little bit on our roadmap and what's in store for the future. So, with that, I'm going to start with Rich.
Thanks, Ann. Fundamentally, and I'm a little biased here, but to my mind, threat-led defense, I think, really is poised to become the operating model for cybersecurity over the next few years. And why is that? It gets back to the laws of physics. As I said earlier, we don't have infinite time. We don't have infinite resources. And therefore, we have to prioritize. We have to contextualize. We have to make hard risk-based decisions around what we're going to deal with today, what we're going to deal with tomorrow, and what we're going to choose not to deal with because we're out of time and resources. And so, and an important thing I always like to emphasize is, we talk about the limitations of sort of existing approaches in terms of, a vulnerability-centric approach. I don't want anyone to think that managing and tracking and patching where possible vulnerabilities in the environment somehow isn't important or isn't necessary anymore. It's absolutely important. But I think a lot of the prioritization and contextualization of where do I put my scarce resources to patch vulnerabilities is kind of the missing link. And so, as I think of threat-led defense, that operating model for cybersecurity going forward, it's really about not only ensuring repeatability and scalability, but another really critical thing that we've seen with our customers that's really gratifying is the connective tissue that we become between their CTI team, their detection engineering team, their red team, their hunt team, security engineering, security architecture, that in that platform, their activities are being linked. And so as CTI discovers new threats, that automatically percolates and informs everyone else's view of the environment. And security engineering implements a new tool or reconfigures a set of tools that essentially in real time percolates again throughout the environment. So no one is off toiling in isolation, solving problems or creating self-licking ice cream cones. People are really focused on solving the problems first and foremost that are driven by the threats that the organization knows it must deal with today.
Terrific. Thanks, Rich. And Frank, we've I think Rich is alluded to it, but we've talked a bit about potentially down the road the convergence of defensive and offensive security. So the idea of threats and vulnerabilities and assets. I'd love for you to expand upon that for our listeners.
Absolutely. And I do think the first part of that is defenses. And before we go on the convergence, I think that's important to note that like a few years ago, I did a different webinar for a different set of people, but it was on the market for lemons in the cybersecurity market. And so it was really trying to articulate that there's this problem around the end user, our customers now, trying to be able to understand what their defenses can do, what their tests are saying, and building up a ecosystem where we could communicate across defense, offense, CTI, and have common ways of communicating. And I think that's a really important dimension to this that I don't want to gloss over is like there has to be transparency around defenses. There has to be transparency around offensive security and being able to marry those things up very well. And I think that's where a platform like ours comes well into play. I'll note that Bill had posted a question on the chat about can you comment on attack mitigations, and I think that's the tip of the iceberg. I think that attack did a really good job of being able to say, here's different types of mitigation strategies that you could use to identify these techniques, but it's surface level at the end of the day, right? You are not a owner of mitigations, at least directly. You are the owner of products. And so that's where we've tried to work with vendors to be able to understand how they defend, right? We've got a large network of working with the vendor to understand what their mappings is, and not just I cover this technique, but how I cover this technique. And by going to the how, now we're providing transparency to the end users, and we can help break down that wall, right? We can help them understand this is the technical ways that these vendors are addressing these techniques, and that they have to reconfigure it this way or that way to get this coverage. Those are really important dimensions to get. So it's great work that where MITRE ATT&CK and with their mitigations work and with their detections work that they are continuing to evolve have done. Definitely encourage the community to look at that and continue to make sense of it, but also really think about it from the vendor perspective and ask your vendors, how do you guys cover attack? And don't be okay with just the glossy, right? Ask them how, and how do I understand that I am configured right? Those are really important questions to have. That's where offensive security comes into play though as well, because, okay, the vendor says they have X. Is it actually configured right? Are they blowing smoke? Those are always things in the back of our mind. And so offensive security needs to come in play to continually validate and continually become one of those things that can make sure that defenses are working as expected, right? You need to know what is expected because tests aren't doing everything, but you need to test to ensure that what you can is actually operational. And I think that you're just one without the other doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Testing just to prove that there's gaps in your defenses doesn't really tell you how to improve. It just tells you that you've got gaps. So you need to understand, have that baseline of what you can do, understand where to test and how to test, validate that things are working, figure out what can plug the gaps, test those things to make sure that they're working. And it just becomes this life cycle and continual iteration around it. I think that that's one place where like things like DORA over in Europe has done a great job about trying to broaden the awareness around the necessity of bringing offensive security into enterprise security. It's not just let's bring in some outside sources and do some red teams. Yeah, that's a component of it. But how can you start doing some continual testing and understand, whether it be with a BAS or whether it be with atomic tests that you write as an organization? You have to continually do this. And I think, again, it's two parts of the puzzle that just have to come together. You have to know what your defenses are. You have to be able to understand that they're working. And it's only with the marriage of those that you can really have confidence in that is what my coverage is. That is what my risk exposure is. This is what I need to do, where I need to invest next, right? It shouldn't be just where your vendors are telling you where you've got coverage or where you think that you do. And maybe where you test it isn't where you should even be focusing your efforts. But with all of that information combined, you have the ability to understand how the big picture comes together.
Yeah, it's a great point. And Rick, there's two pieces of the puzzle, but it's like who's on first. So what comes first?
What comes first?
So two pieces of the puzzle. We have, threat-led defense and defensive security, and then testing and offensive security.
Got it.
And the question gets asked often by a lot of the customers, what comes first?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's funny. It depends on who you ask when you get the question. When oftentimes though, when we're talking with customers, I think we get we sort of help them understand the perspective of sort of starting with from a very strategic perspective, what it is you believe about one, who's attacking you with what, then two, what you believe your defensive posture is against those things in a very manageable, scalable way. I mean, just if you generally ask, although interesting, if you ask an organization that may not have a threat-led defense platform, if you ask, can you defend against scattered spiders? I can almost promise you if they come back within the next 24 hours with an answer that they're guessing. They really don't know that they have, adequate levels of defenses against the behaviors that scattered spiders has been known to use. I think, so in my view, generally it's, establishing what it is you believe from the defensive perspective, identifying where you see the highest levels of residual risk exist based on who's attacking you with what, and the configuration of the tools that you've deployed in your environment, understanding what it is they ameliorate and what it is they do not, and then focusing your testing activities on those areas that represent the highest levels of residual risk. Another way, although it's a little bit trite, sometimes I'll say the question, or I'll answer that question sometimes on sort of the testing side. Do you test first, or do you sort of build your architecture first? And in my perspective is generally, well, you can't really learn organic chemistry by taking organic chemistry exams. You really do have to go through this discipline of sort of understanding what your threats are, what your defenses are within context, and then implement the testing to support whatever that view might be. Hopefully that answered your question.
Sure, sure. So we've got about a few minutes here before we take any further questions to try to wrap up. And so maybe Rich, you can talk a little bit about, what our listeners have to look forward to and what's on the roadmap for the near future.
Yeah, as I said on LinkedIn today, I'm running out of adjectives. Last week we were talking about how we're rolling out control frameworks, which I think is a really significant point, because what we've realized is that all of the data that we have in the platform to implement a threat-led view of your coverage in your enterprise is also a treasure trove of evidence that you can use to automatically demonstrate compliance to various security control frameworks, whether it's in NIST CSF 853, CIS 18, CRI Common Profile, or others. So that's something that actually we've released, and we're going to be rolling out those control frameworks. Super excited, because that starts to marry up the operational security team in a really efficient and cost-effective way with the needs of the GRC team, where the operational security folks can be feeding that evidence essentially in real time without anyone going in and taking screenshots of tools. Obviously procedures is the word of the day. And I'm not just excited about what we're releasing now. I'm excited about all of the things. We loved Harrison and Zero Shot so much that we acquired him and his company at the end of last year, and he's now our director of AI. The things that are going to come out of his organization are going to blow people's minds. And then, back to this idea of contextualization and prioritization, the work we're going to be doing and delivering this second half of the year around giving people that understanding and contextualization of their assets at the asset level, as well as helping them prioritize the vulnerabilities that they face in the environment based on both threat and this deep understanding of what defenses are there. So again, holistic keeps, is the word of the day. We keep coming back to that holistic view where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, because when you put all this information together in a platform like ours, you all of a sudden start to see that many more use cases and that many more opportunities to improve security, improve efficiency, frankly, improve the day-to-day life of the people working in the SOC or CTI or detection engineering by making it less busy work, more, leveraging their innate talents and judgment so that we can all improve security.
Terrific, terrific. And Frank, and then I'll end with Rick. Your thoughts on, the future for Tidal Cyber.
Yeah, I'm super excited. I think that being able to structure procedural information is just like that first step on the journey. We know people have a hard time understanding which hunts to go after, which detections to write. There's so many options, just great resources, right? I mean, think about Sigma having so much popularity out there with 2,000 plus rules, right? But which one do I need to write? And how do I make sure it's not the same as a vendor's already created and deployed because they have access to that same repo? It's like, how do you prioritize? Procedures is going to be key to all of that. So if we're really talking about work efficiencies, I think there's so much we can do there. I think that also then leads itself to making it so that we can make attack even more something that the larger community can adopt.
Yeah.
I think that it's really hard for organizations to understand like which rule to write, which detection do I need to write, because they're spending so much time trying to just understand the threat. But if we have a very good understanding of the deep technical details about how threats are doing things, we can now focus that person to figure out what to do about it, and less about trying to figure out, okay, is this the same or is this different than what I've seen before? Because we've already answered that for them. So a lot of good excitement around how to actually make it so that we can have some really good data-driven decisions for the actual analysts that are out there.
Terrific. And Rick, we have a question actually for you
Sure.
that's come in. And if you could share a little bit around coverage mapping and how we share the combination of threats and defensive stacks and recommendations in a coverage map.
Sure. Best to think of a coverage map is the way that we render that graphically is at the top level, the tactics that an adversary must sort of traverse in order to go from reconnaissance to impact. And then beneath that is a set of techniques or sub techniques that the adversary or the adversaries that you're evaluating have to pull from that or they've been known to use in order to affect a given tactic. The way that we look at that in a coverage map is in a sort of a structured and standardized way to help a customer understand if an unacceptable level of residual risk exists on a given technique or sub technique. And that's important for them because they do have, as Rich pointed out, scarce resources, not enough time, not enough people. I don't know a CISO that thinks he has or she has enough of either one of those. And so they have to really decide where they spend their next labor hour or their next dollar, and helping them in a very scalable way do that is what we do. And we do that with some clever approaches toward a thing called threat profiling and defensive stacking. Both of them are analogous. On the threat side, what we do is we help a customer without having to make a huge investment in human capital or threat intelligence resources. We give them the ability to understand who's attacking them with which behavior, generally at the technique and sub-technique level. And then we compare that to the defensive capabilities that exist in the defensive stack. And so in the defensive stack, what we're doing is breaking down at as low level of abstraction as we can get the level of risk reduction that a given set of tools as they're configured are actually delivering. So in some cases, for example, in an EDR, it could be hundreds of capabilities that are available. In other cases, it might be a smaller subset, but generally helping a customer understand in combination the relative level of risk reduction they're getting on a technique by technique basis is what we do really well. And that was sort of born out of one, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in building the platform, but two, a lot of relationships that we have developed over the years and with vendors that have bought into the discipline. We bring those two things together into a coverage map that lives and breathes. As the adversary evolves, so does the coverage map. As the defensive stack evolves, so does the coverage map.
Terrific. All right, so we've got 30 seconds, and Rick, I want to take this time to have you take us home, wrap it up, and then we'll close.
Yeah, so what I would say is it's been an incredible journey. This isn't my first security startup. It is, the one that has been the most fun and the most rewarding. I think, as Frank was intimating, I think we all came from MITRE. We're very mission-oriented people, and I think what we're driven by is, one, the fact that threat-led defense is new and better. It is a new discipline that will actually help customers be able to get more risk reduction per dollar spent, more risk reduction per labor hour across the board. It is important for large companies and small companies that don't have enough resources to be able to do it this way. What we're super psyched about is the fact that we're making it easy. We've innovated in all the right places where we can take that immense amount of labor that made this prohibitively expensive, not prohibitively expensive anymore. In that regard, I think you're going to see us democratize this so that it is achievable by any kind of company. And I think what I'm most excited about is when we're starting to see glimpses of this in DORA and other regulations, but as this starts to evolve and become easier to do and more ubiquitous, you will see this become part of the minimum standard of care.
Terrific. All right. Well, this concludes the Tidal Wave webcast on threat-led defense. I would like to thank all of you for joining us, and a big thank you to our guest speakers, Rich, Rick, and Frank. Thank you so much. And please note that this webcast has been recorded and will be available on demand at tidalcyber.com. So thank you for joining us today.